The wagon was already moving when Clara Mae hit the ground. She did not fall dramatically. She did not scream. She simply slipped, one small bare foot catching the edge of the wooden step, and then she was down, face first in the cold red clay of the mountain trail, her palms splitting open against the gravel, her chin scraping rock. The pain was immediate and bright, but she did not cry out. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose the way she had taught herself to do, because crying brought attention, and attention in that house had never once been kind. She was 5 years old, and she had already learned more about survival than any child should ever have to know. She pushed herself upright slowly, blinking the dirt from her eyes. The mule shifted in its harness. The wagon had not stopped. It was not going to stop. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose on every side of her, ancient and enormous, wrapped in the amber and rust of late October. The morning fog moved between the pine trees like something breathing, slow and cold and indifferent. The trail wound upward ahead of the wagon and disappeared into the mist, and the wheels kept turning, and the sound of them grew quieter with every second, and Clara Mae Bennett stood in the middle of that mountain road and understood with a clarity that no 5-year-old should possess that she had been left. She looked down at her hands. Blood was running in thin lines across her palms, dripping from her fingertips into the red clay dirt. She looked at the rag bundle that Ruth Ann had thrown from the wagon seat before it moved, a piece of old cloth tied around a few stale cornbread crusts, and she picked it up carefully and held it against her chest. Then she ran after the wagon. She ran until the gravel tore her feet open. She ran until the cold air burned in her lungs like fire. She ran screaming into the Appalachian fog with everything her small body had left to give. "Please come back, please. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Mama, please." The word hung in the cold mountain air long after the wagon had gone. Mama. The word that Ruth Ann Walker had never once deserved, and now permanently revoked. The fog swallowed the wagon whole. The sound of the wheels faded into the mist, and then there was nothing. Nothing but the wind through the pines, the distant cry of a hawk, and the sound of a 5-year-old girl standing alone on a mountain trail, learning in real time what it meant to be completely, permanently unwanted. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the bleeding to slow, long enough for the cold to settle into her bare feet, long enough for something inside her small chest to go very quiet. Not peaceful, but the kind of quiet that comes after something breaks. Then she sat down in the dirt, pulled the bread bundle against her heart, and began to talk to herself the way frightened children do when there is no one left. "Be good, Clara. Be quiet. Mama gets mad when you're loud." It had not begun that morning. The abandonment had been building for 2 years, slowly, quietly, the way rot moves through timber. From the outside, no one would have seen it clearly. Thomas Walker was not the kind of man who beat children or shouted in public. He was simply weak. Weak in the particular way of men who know something is wrong and choose, again and again, to say nothing. He had taken Clara in after her mother died of fever along the roadside near Burnsville, a stranger's child, a Christian obligation, a decision made in a moment of decency that his wife had never forgiven him for. Ruth Ann Walker was not a woman who hated children. She simply loved comfort more than she loved sacrifice. And Clara Mae Bennett, small, quiet, perpetually hungry, perpetually in the way, represented nothing but sacrifice. There was no blood between them, no softness, no patience. There was only the cold arithmetic of a poor mountain household where every extra mouth had a cost, and Clara's cost had always outweighed her value in Ruth Ann's careful accounting. Clara had understood this without being told. Children always understand these things before they have the words for them. She had spent 2 years becoming invisible, eating less, speaking less, taking up less space, apologizing in advance for the simple crime of existing. She moved through that house like a shadow, learning to be smaller. She answered questions with single words. She finished chores before being asked. She flinched at raised voices, not because she was always hit, but because she had learned that the space between a raised voice and a raised hand was very small and very unpredictable. On the last morning, Ruth Ann had not even looked at her when she spoke. "I am done," she said, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Done feeding somebody else's burden." And Thomas Walker, weak to the very last, had said nothing more. The Appalachian woods in late October are not cruel. They are simply honest. They do not pretend to be safe. The fog moves through the pines without apology. The darkness comes early and completely, not the soft darkness of a town with lamplight in the windows, but the absolute consuming dark of old wilderness, where the trees grow so thick that even moonlight cannot find its way through. Clara walked because standing still felt like giving up, and something in her, some small, stubborn flame that cold and hunger and 2 years of Ruth Ann Walker had not managed to extinguish, refused to give up. She did not know where she was going. She knew only the direction of downhill, and she followed it, her bleeding feet leaving small dark prints on the pale gravel, her breath making clouds in the cold air. She talked to herself as she walked, not in the way of madness, but in the way of a child who has learned that silence is its own kind of terror. "Maybe Mama forgot me by accident," she said quietly. "Maybe she'll remember and come back." Then, a few minutes later, in a smaller voice, "Maybe she won't." The wolves called to each other somewhere deep in the ridge, low, mournful, impossibly distant, and yet too close. Clara walked faster. An owl swept silently overhead, its wings cutting the fog without a sound. The dead leaves crunched beneath her feet with every step, each one seeming too loud in the enormous quiet of the mountains. She stopped when she could walk no further, and sat down against the base of a pine tree, drawing her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. The bread bundle sat in her lap. She did not eat it. She was saving it. Because hungry children learn very quickly that what you have today may not come again tomorrow. She looked up through the pine branches at the gray October sky and prayed. Not with practiced words, not with the formal language of Sunday mornings, but with the raw and honest voice of a child who has nothing left but the hope that something somewhere is listening. "God," she whispered, "if you can hear me, I don't want to die out here." The wind moved through the pines. The fog thickened between the trees. And then she heard footsteps. Jasper Crow moved through the woods the way dangerous men always move, slowly, without urgency, as though time and outcomes are things he has already arranged to his own satisfaction. He had been following the blood trail for nearly half a mile before he saw her. Tiny smears of red against the pale gravel, small bare footprints pressed into the cold mud, each one growing closer together as she had slowed and tired. He was not the kind of man whose danger announced itself. That was precisely what made him so dangerous. He had the face of someone's helpful neighbor, weathered, unremarkable, carrying an easy smile that he wore the way a hunter wears camouflage. He had drifted through the mountain counties of Western Carolina for years, appearing in places where vulnerability gathered, where the desperate and the lost and the very young could be found without witnesses. He stepped out from behind a thick pine and looked down at Clara with an expression of practiced concern. "Well now," he said softly, "what have we got here?" Clara went completely still. She pressed herself back against the bark of the tree and stared at him and said absolutely nothing, because she recognized something in his voice the way a rabbit recognizes a shadow before it understands the hawk, not with thought, but with the deep animal instinct of a creature that has survived long enough to know what threat smells like. "Now, sweetheart," said Jasper, taking one slow step forward. "You don't belong out here alone. It ain't safe for a little girl in these woods after dark." His voice was gentle. Gentle in the way of things that want you to stop being afraid before they hurt you. Clara pulled herself tighter against the tree. Her eyes tracked him without blinking. She did not speak. She did not move. She breathed in small, careful measures, and she prayed again. Just one word this time. Wordless, more feeling than language, a pure and desperate reaching toward anything that might help. Jasper's smile tightened at the corners. "I said, come on out." His voice dropped half a register. The gentleness thinned. "Don't make me ask again, girl." He took another step, and then another. The fog moved between them like a curtain. Clara pressed so hard against the pine bark that the rough wood bit into her back through her thin dress. Her hands found a root and gripped it. Then she heard the hoofbeats. They came from somewhere up the trail, steady, unhurried, the rhythm of a horse being ridden by someone who had no reason to rush because he had already decided what he was going to do. The sound moved through the fog and grew louder, and Jasper Crow heard it too, and something in his posture changed, a barely visible tightening, a recalibration. The horse emerged from the mist like a thought becoming solid. Elijah Boone was not a large man in the way that stories usually mean when they describe large men. He was not broad or towering or physically imposing in any obvious sense. He was lean and weathered and straight-backed in the saddle, with hands that had seen 60 years of hard mountain living, and a face that had been carved by grief into something quiet and permanent. He wore no expression that could be easily read. His eyes found Jasper Crow immediately and stayed there with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who has assessed danger so many times that it no longer raises his pulse. He had been a field medic in the final years of the Civil War. He had pressed his hands against wounds that should have been fatal and sometimes made them survivable through will alone. He had come home to these mountains and built a farm and married a woman named Anna who laughed easily and loved fiercely, and died 3 days after their daughter was born. He had raised that daughter, Eleanor, dark-haired and bright-eyed, alone through 7 winters, until a fever came through the valley in the spring of 1882 and took her in 4 days. He had been alone in that farmhouse for 9 years, moving through his days with the steady, purposeful endurance of a man who has decided that grief does not excuse a person from the responsibility of continuing. He stopped his horse 12 feet from where Jasper stood and looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then he said, quietly and without decoration, "Step away from that tree." There was no threat in his voice, no anger, no performance. Just the flat, certain weight of a man who has long since stopped having anything left to lose, and therefore cannot be frightened by anyone who still has things they are trying to protect. Jasper Crow looked at him. He knew that face. Everyone in the mountain counties knew Elijah Boone, not from legend, not from reputation deliberately built, but in the way that people know a mountain. It is simply there, permanent, unmoved by weather. Jasper took a step back, then another. Then he turned and walked into the fog and did not look back. The woods grew quiet again. The horse shifted. Elijah Boone sat perfectly still in the saddle for a moment, looking at the pine tree where 2 small hands still gripped a root and 2 dark eyes still watched him from the shadows. He climbed down from his horse. He did not move quickly. He crossed the distance between them slowly, the way you approach something wounded, and then he lowered himself to one knee in the cold dirt of the mountain trail, bringing himself to her level, making himself smaller, removing the advantage of his height so that she would not have to look up at him the way she had spent her whole life looking up to people who towered over her with bad intentions. He looked at her for a long moment. He saw the blood on her palms, the swollen, muddy feet, the tear tracks dried in the dirt on her face. The bread bundle clutched against her chest with both arms as though it were the most important thing in the world. And understanding what that meant, what it said about the life she had been living, he felt something move through him that he had not felt in years. Something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the narrow space between them. "Sweetheart," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "When did you last eat something warm?" Clara looked at him for a long time. She was measuring him the way abused children measure adults, not by what they say, but by the distance between what they say and what their eyes are doing. His eyes were steady. They did not dart. They did not calculate. They simply looked at her and waited and held the kind of patience that cannot be performed by people who do not actually feel it. She answered in a voice barely louder than the wind in the pines. "I wasn't hungry enough to matter." The words hit him like a stone dropped from a great height, because no child, no 5-year-old child, arrives at a sentence like that without having been taught it, without having been shown again and again in ways large and small that her hunger was an inconvenience and her needs were a burden, and her existence was something to be tolerated rather than cherished. Elijah Boone had held dying men in the mud of battlefields and kept his face composed, because composure was what they needed from him. He had stood at 2 graves on a cold mountain hillside without allowing himself to fall apart, because there was no one left to put him back together. He came closer to breaking in that moment than he had in 30 years. He breathed. He steadied. He looked at her small, serious, careful face, a face that had already learned to expect nothing. And he said the only true thing he had. "Well, you matter to me." He wrapped her in a quilt before he lifted her onto the horse, his daughter Eleanor's quilt, the one with the blue and yellow patches that Anna had sewn by firelight in the first year of their marriage. He had kept it folded on the chest at the foot of his bed for 9 years. He had not been able to explain why, even to himself. Perhaps he had known, in whatever quiet way a person knows things they cannot articulate, that it was still waiting for someone. When the fabric settled around Clara's thin shoulders, she flinched, a small, involuntary pulling away, the body's memory of hands that had not always been gentle. Elijah saw it and went still, and waited. And slowly, in her own time, in her own measure, she leaned into the warmth. Her small body softened by degrees, like frozen ground softens in early spring, not all at once, but inevitably. They rode through the dark mountains in silence. The horse moved steady and slow along the ridge trail, the fog parting gently around them, the stars beginning to appear in the gaps between the pine branches above. Clara sat wrapped in the quilt in front of him, fighting sleep with everything she had left. Because abandoned children are afraid of closing their eyes. They have learned that the world rearranges itself while they are not watching. They have learned that sleep is just another form of trust, and trust is something that has always been used against them. She fought it for a long time. Then, in a voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the sound of the wind, she spoke. "If I fall asleep, will you still be here when I wake up?" Elijah felt the question move through him like cold water through broken ground, finding every crack, filling every hollow. "Yeah, baby girl, I'll still be here." She was asleep within minutes. Her head came to rest against his arm. Her breathing slowed and deepened. The bread bundle stayed clutched in her hands even in sleep, her small fingers locked around it, unable even in unconsciousness to fully believe that what she had would still be there in the morning. Elijah rode the rest of the way home with one arm steady around her and his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, and something shifting quietly in his chest, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. The healing was slow. It is always slow, with children who have learned that love is temporary and kindness comes with conditions. In the first weeks, Clara hid bread under her pillow every night, not because she was hungry, because she was afraid that abundance was a season and she needed to be ready for when it ended. Elijah discovered it one morning when he changed her bedding. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, looking at the small, careful cache of biscuit pieces and dried cornbread wrapped in a piece of cloth. Then he went downstairs and made breakfast and said nothing. Nothing except to ensure, from that morning forward, that the bread plate on the table was always full. She apologized constantly, for the space she occupied, for the questions she asked, for the sound of her footsteps, for existing at a volume that was perceptible to other people. Once, she knocked a clay cup from the table and went white as chalk, pressing herself back against the wall with her hands over her face, waiting. Elijah picked up the pieces of the cup from the floor without hurry. Then he looked at her, pressed against the wall, hands shaking, braced for a punishment that he was never going to deliver. And he said simply, "It was just a cup, Clara. Cups can be replaced." She stared at him. Something moved across her face. Fusion first, then something raw and undefended, something that had not yet learned how to be safe be seen. She began to cry. Not the careful, controlled weeping of a child managing her own emotions, but the real kind, the deep, released kind that comes when a person finally exhales something they have been holding for so long they forgot they were holding it. He did not rush to her. He did not tell her it was fine or that she needed to stop. He simply sat down on the floor of that kitchen and waited, and when she was ready, she crossed the room and sat down beside him, and they stayed there together on the cold kitchen floor in the early morning light until she was finished. That was the day something in Clara Mae Bennett began, at last, to believe. The seasons turned. Autumn became winter, became spring. Clara learned to read by firelight, sounding out words slowly while Elijah listened without impatience. She learned that winter came and went and the food always came back. She learned that a raised voice in the yard was just Elijah calling the dog and not the beginning of something terrible. She learned slowly and imperfectly, and in the way that all real healing happens, not in a moment, but in 1,000 small moments accumulated over time, that safety was not a trap, that kindness did not expire, that she was allowed to take up space. Elijah learned things too. He learned that a house with a child in it sounds entirely different from a house without one. He learned that grief, left long enough in the presence of new love, does not disappear, but changes, becomes something less like an open wound and more like a scar, still there, still part of you, but no longer bleeding. He learned that Eleanor's quilt had found the right person after all. The trouble came in the autumn of 1899, when Clara was 13 years old and Elijah's land had become something worth fighting over. Ruth Ann and Thomas Walker arrived at the Buncombe County Courthouse in Asheville with a lawyer and a document and the particular confidence of people who have convinced themselves that selfishness is justice when enough time has passed. The land, more than 40 acres along the ridge with clean water and good timber, was now worth considerably more than it had been a decade before. And somewhere in the cold arithmetic that had always governed Ruth Ann's relationship with the world, Clara Mae Bennett had been recalculated into an asset. They called themselves her guardians. They spoke in the language of legal obligation and Christian responsibility. They did not once look at Clara directly. Clara sat in that courtroom straight-backed and clear-eyed and entirely without fear. She had spent 8 years rebuilding herself in the mountain farmhouse with Elijah Boone. She had learned to read, to speak, to stand inside her own life without apologizing for it. She was 13 years old, and she had already survived things that most adults never face. And she knew, in the bone-deep way of someone who has earned their knowledge at great cost, exactly who she was, and exactly what had happened to her, and exactly what the truth was. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood. She looked at Ruth Ann Walker for the first time since the mountain trail. Ruth Ann looked away. The day they left me in those woods, I stopped being their child. The courtroom was very quiet. I was 5 years old, barefoot and bleeding on a mountain trail in October. I ran after that wagon until I couldn't run anymore. I begged them to come back." She paused, breathed. They didn't. She turned and looked at Elijah, who sat 3 rows back with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on her face, steady and patient and full of something that had no name but did not require one. "Elijah Boone came back for me. He's the only person in my life who ever did. He fed me. He taught me to read. He sat on the kitchen floor with me when I cried. He never once raised his hand to me. He never once made me feel like I was a burden." She looked back at the judge. "That is what a parent is. Not blood, not a legal document. What a parent is staying." The judge looked at her for a long time. Then he looked down at the papers before him. Then he picked up his pen. Elijah Boone legally adopted Clara Mae Bennett on the 4th day of November, 1899. When the papers were signed and the courtroom began to empty, Elijah walked to where she stood and looked at her. This girl he had found bleeding on a mountain trail. This girl who had hidden bread under her pillow. This girl who had cried on a kitchen floor and then gotten up again. And he said the words she had waited her entire childhood to hear truly and without condition. "Welcome home, daughter." Many years passed. Clara grew into a woman of quiet, considerable strength. She became a schoolteacher in the mountain counties, patient with frightened children in the particular way of people who remember what it felt like to be one. She married a good man. She raised 3 children who never once doubted that they were wanted. She carried within her both the wound of what had been done to her and the grace of what had been given to her. And she understood, as all survivors eventually do, that neither cancels the other out. They simply become part of the whole of who you are. Elijah lived long enough to hold her firstborn child in his arms, a girl with dark eyes who reached up and grabbed his finger and held on. He looked down at that small hand wrapped around his weathered finger, and something in his face went very still and very full at the same time, as though every loss he had ever carried had finally, at last, been answered. He died on a quiet morning in late autumn. The leaves were falling. Clara stood beside his grave on the ridge above the farm on a cold November afternoon, holding wildflowers in one hand. In her other hand, she held a piece of frayed, stained cloth, the rag bundle that Ruth Ann Walker had thrown into the mountain mud on the morning the world had ended, and then, in the same breath, begun again. She had kept it her whole life. She knelt and placed it beside his headstone with the careful reverence of someone laying down something sacred. And she whispered into the cold mountain air what she had carried inside her for decades, the truest and most complete thing she knew. "You came back for me. Nobody ever came back for me before you." The wind moved through the pines. The October leaves let go and drifted slowly down. And somewhere in the patient silence of those ancient mountains, in the fog and the amber light and the cold, clean air that smelled of pine and earth and coming winter, something broken rested, finally and completely, in peace. If Clara Mae's story moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you that one person's choice to stay can change the entire direction of a life, then you are exactly who Desert Heart was made for. Subscribe to this channel and ring that bell so you never miss a story. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're listening from tonight, because every single one of you matters here, just like Clara Mae always did. We'll see you at the next story. This story holds real and lasting value on several levels. It portrays childhood trauma, abandonment, emotional neglect, and the behavioral patterns that follow with honesty and accuracy. Viewers who recognize a child hiding food, flinching at kindness, or apologizing for existing will understand, perhaps for the first time, what those behaviors mean and where they come from. That recognition has genuine educational value. The story also demonstrates that healing from early trauma is possible, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the patient, daily accumulation of consistency, safety, and chosen love. It shows that found families are sacred, that parenthood is defined not by biology, but by presence and commitment, that one person's decision to stay in a single moment on a cold mountain trail can redirect an entire life. For older American audiences, this story connects to values that run deep in the culture: the protection of the innocent, quiet masculine strength and responsibility, the sanctity of home and belonging, loyalty, and the enduring belief that goodness, even when surrounded by hardship, ultimately prevails. It is a story about survival, but more than that, it is a story about being chosen, and being chosen after a life of being left is one of the most profound and universal human experiences there is.